We're going to get into this story with breaking points because I've been noticing something. There seems to be this I guess I won't say anti-China. There seems to be a lot of fear mongering coming from breaking points about China. And it's worrisome. Now I have a clip here that I'm going to play. By the way, the name of this video is called Why a Peaking China is Dangerous for the World. Now, this is the Realignment podcast. This is the show that Marshall Kosloff is a part of. He's also a part of Breaking Points. They're basically creating like a TYT style network thing. But some of these talking points I've been hearing, I kind of feel like I'm listening to mainstream media. And Sabby don't like it. So let's go ahead and get into this discussion. Listen to this.
Hey, Breaking Points. Check out this clip from my conversation with Michael Beckley about the relative strengths of the United States and China and how these strengths and weaknesses play into avoiding a conflict over the next decade.
You are really just pushing back against both of those frames, both like the US as a declining power and then China as the rising power. So can you start with the US first? Like, why should we interpret this coming decade through the perspective of America not being on the decline?
Well, I think if you look at sort of broad indicators of just which country has more wealth, which country has more military power projection capabilities, there's still a large gap between the United States and China. The US has roughly 3 to 4 times China's overall wealth. And in terms of just being able to deploy military forces around the world and fight wars far from your shores, it's still stacked very heavily in America's favor. I do think that there are.
We're going to touch on this point right here. See, I'm not even 2 minutes in already. Let's go.
Through the perspective of America not being on the decline.
Well, I think if you look at sort of broad indicators of just which country has more wealth, which country has more military power projection capabilities, there's still a large gap between the United States and China. The US has roughly 3 to 4 times China's overall wealth. And in terms of just being able to deploy military forces around the world and fight wars far from your shores, it's still stacked very heavily in America's favor.
It's still stacked very heavily in America's favor. To be able to deploy troops around the world. Why is this a pro? What's good about that? What's positive about that? What? Why is it considered? Why are we talking about this as though this is a positive thing for the United States government to have these bases all over the world? Why are we saying it this way? Where's the pushback? I hear none. Let's go back in.
I do think that there are local balances of power, though, where things have shifted in China's favor. So one is in the Taiwan Strait, where just because of the combination of geography and technology, China has home field advantage, essentially. It's only 100 miles from China. It's thousands of miles from the US. And the nature of precision-guided munitions just makes sitting ducks out of a lot of the very powerful capabilities that the United States has, like its aircraft carriers and those big bases. So even though the overall balance of power remains stacked very much in America's favor, and even though the long-term prospects of both countries for demographic reasons, for geographic and resource reasons, for alliance and diplomatic reasons, I think is even more stacked in America's favor, and the long-term trends are very favorable to the United States. There are these
stacked in America's favor. You see how they're talking about this? Pay attention to it.
Local balances of power where China has really translated a lot of its latent power into hard power assets on the ground, whether it's warships, sovereign loans around the developing world, in a very aggressive way. And so that's why, in this second book, I became much more focused on, okay, what happens when you have a power that is peaking and is not going to catch up to its main rival? Do they mellow out and dial back their ambitions? And in this new book, Hal and I go through all the historical cases where we've had a peaking power and they don't mellow out. They try to batter their way through the hard times. They try to score near-term victories that alter the long-term trends. And they try to basically grab whatever they can while they still can. And so that makes these local balances of power much more salient in this decade. So I think you can be.
He said they try to grab whatever power they can. Don't we do the same thing? Doesn't the United States government try to grab and hold on to whatever it can? Isn't that why the United States government for decades, and I actually showed a video on this one time going all the way back, the number of countries that the United States government has either intervened in or has stolen goods from? Isn't that something the United States government has been doing for decades? Are you kidding me? Oh, but I get it. I see. He only wants the US to be able to do that, not another country. Because the United States government wants to be the only one that's in power. They want to police the world. I don't think that's okay. I don't agree with that.
Be both confident about the long-term trends for the United States, but deeply worried about some of these short-term red lights that are flashing over, especially over something like Taiwan.
You know, I'm curious. So the good way to think of the peaking power framework is these peaking powers take disastrous gambles. Japan, Pearl Harbor, we went over that, various references to Germany at various points during its history.
Let's talk about disastrous gambles that the United States government has taken. I don't know. Afghanistan. Sanctions on the people in Afghanistan, starving people in Afghanistan. What about Somalia? What about the United States government has done to people in Africa? Hell, all the brown countries in the world. When we talk about gambles, come on. There's no other country that has done these atrocities that the United States government has done the way that the US has done it for decades. You've got to be kidding me. The way that they have intervened in countries abroad. And by the time the US government, they pull the troops out, the people there are worse off than they were before we showed up. Stealing resources. Let's talk about it. Why are you in Afghanistan? What was there? Opium, right? That's part of it. That's a big part of it. They'll tell you that we were there to help the women and the children. It was never about the women and the children, because if it was, you wouldn't have killed them. It's about resources. It's about money. It's about preventing any other country from rising up and gaining any type of power. It's about control. I can't believe this.
Has there been a case where the gamble is paid off?
So the big ones where you have a country that, goes on like a Hitler style rampage, those basically never end well. But I think there's a selection factor going on there, namely that the countries that had to go on Imperial Japan or Hitler style rampages were in the kind of, from their perspective, the most dire situations. And so they had to use force, and the deck was already stacked against them. One of our cases is actually the United States in the late 19th century, where after the Civil War, there was actually an economic boom in the United States. The U.S. economy takes off, is growing like gangbusters. But then in the 1880s and going into the 1890s, you have a series of depressions, and there was this perception that the U.S. had already expanded across the continent, and there were no more greenfield investment opportunities. We were running out of markets and resources, and that creates this push for what becomes the grand era of American imperialism abroad. The U.S. reacts by basically pumping exports and investment into Latin America and East Asia, and then building a huge military, especially a navy, to go protect those assets, and eventually ends up annexing territory way beyond its borders. And you could argue that in the U.S. case, it ultimately proved effective because the United States continued to grow, and that was one step towards becoming a major global power. I think the U.S.
That was one step into becoming a major global power. That's what it's all about. Wow.
This case, though, is not comparable to China today, because for one thing, the United States, it was just growing demographically. It had tons of resources that China doesn't have. And it was emerging in the Western hemisphere where there weren't other great powers, right? I mean, like at least their homelands, all of their homelands are based in Eurasia. Eurasia is just a death trap for rising powers. I mean, any power that's tried to rise there and beat back its rivals usually gets crushed in a vice of all the other great powers ganging up on them, often with help from the United States. And that's what I think China is facing today. So they're not quite comparable, but if you're looking for a success case, I mean, the United States battered its way through those hard times in the 19th century and ends up emerging even more powerful and internationally engaged after its economic troubles in the 1880s and 1890s.
What do you think about America decline narratives? I think that there's, it's sort of, as a podcaster, I'm kind of a professional zeitgeist watcher. And I think what's annoying about this conversation is you'll see people just give this, look at all these problems, polarization, political violence, gas, demographic, all these bits. And, you could say, well, I mean, look at the mid 1970s, post Watergate, Vietnam defeat, 58,000 American, troops dead. It seems like on most of those, a seemingly resurgent Soviet Union, it seems that at most of these decline, think of even like, Japan's going to overtake America in the 80s. It seems like most of these times we've hit just decline narratives. They've been, and I guess this gets to why I think your book is like really useful. Short term, it's easy to tell a story of American decline in the 70s and 80s. Long term, we were good to go. But now it seems the issue is it's the short term that actually matters the most with a possible conflict with China. So can you just reflect on that?
What conflict? I feel like, what is the conflict? What is happening right now? What is the conflict? Because last I checked, it seemed like we were poking them. They weren't poking us. I think people want these things to happen. I really do. I think there are people that they're just, a lot of them, some of them are warmongers. They're imperialists. They want to see the U.S. have conflict with someone. They want the U.S. to just take over the world and to be that global power that he was referring to earlier in the video. I really think some people really get off on that. Seriously. Forget about the people in those countries that had nothing to do with this. The civilians.
Yeah, I mean, I think, people that tout American decline in some ways are a source of strength for the United States in the sense that you highlight weaknesses in the system and that can generate support for reforms. I mean, that's a critical weakness, I think, of the Chinese system. When you have a dictatorship, you can't let the dictator look unknowing or unwise or admit to major mistakes or turn things around. You ban negative news, which is what China has done on the economic.
Hold up. No. Is he really talking about how China is banning negative news? What does the U.S. government ban? Seriously? Has he not been paying attention to all the people that have been censored in independent media? All the people who were kicked off of Spotify? All the people who lost their shows on RT? All the people who have been banned from PayPal and Venmo? How are you going to talk about another country preventing negative news? And our country right here, the United States government, is censoring actual journalists because they're telling both sides of the story. They're telling information that the U.S. Mainstream media is leaving out. How can you say that? This is unbelievable. I can't. Guys, make sure you hit that like button if you haven't had a chance to do so. Let's go back. He's talking about China as if we don't do those same things here. If anything, for the people who are watching, for all the people who are trying to make you afraid of China, if anything, I think people should be afraid of us. People should be afraid of the U.S. government more than they should be afraid of China.
Sphere, and that makes smart reforms difficult. And so in the US case, I think you can walk a fine line and say, look, it's actually good that we are constantly airing our dirty laundry, that we are paying that there's always an opposition party that is looking to essentially highlight all of the mistakes and all the terrible things that are going on under the watch of the other.
No, we don't. If that were the case, if we were always highlighting our dirty laundry, like he said, if that were the case, where are all the people? Where are the list of names of Epstein's clients? If we're airing our dirty laundry, where's that? Because yes, they got Ghislaine Maxwell, but where's the book of names? Since we air our dirty laundry, where's that? Thank you so much for that reminder, Hall Report. Same thing. Don't forget about Julian Assange. Come on, are we serious? Who is this guy? Hold on. Let me see. I'm sorry, guys. I forgot to tell you his name. Is his name mentioned here? Professor Michael Beckley. Oh my God. I can't, man. There's just some things I just can't.
Party, but I do worry that it is possible to cross that line from declinism to sort of nihilism and defeatism, such that you end up focusing more on your domestic political opponents and tearing each other apart rather than collaborating and coming together to actually fix a lot of these problems, which there always are going to be in the United States.
There's that word again, that nihilism, attacking your political opponents in the United States instead of coming together. And bro, you straight up out here throwing fear mongering about China. Are you kidding me? When he talk about come together and working together, getting things done, we've been talking about that on RBN, but that's not going to happen electorally. It is not. We try to tell everybody, vote third party, vote independent. But if you want immediate help right now, you need to do mutual aid. You need to do direct action. We need a mass movement in this country on the outside to put that pressure onto those politicians. Talk about working together. Most people in this space don't want to do it. Most people in this space don't want to leave their seat. They're too comfortable.
I actually worry very much that even though the United States has tremendous advantages, demographic, geographic, in terms of its alliance structure, its basing structure around the world, that it could still crumble from within. I mean, we've seen that historically too, where great empires fall prey to corruption and political division and even civil war.
What are you talking about? We already corrupt. We are already corrupt. Maybe it's time for it to happen. Maybe this time it's going to happen to us, to our country. You ever think about that? Because the U.S. government has intervened and they've gotten involved in Haiti. Haiti has crumbled. Syria, Afghanistan. Maybe it's time to go full circle, and maybe this time it's time for it to happen to the U.S. Did you ever think that? But he's talking like the United States has never been corrupt. Do you know the history of what has happened to people in this country? What's happened to people right now?
And in the United States today, I mean, levels of polarization are at their highest levels since the Civil War. And, I think this upcoming election is actually a very scary moment for the nation. I don't think it will necessarily collapse, but it just could be a much uglier period in American politics, and that could slow the U.S. ability to respond to major international events.
So for the last question, I realized we kind of buried the lead when it came to why is China actually a peaking power? Can you actually just outline for folks why long term, aside from this decade, and once again, we know this, internally, this is a concern within the Chinese Communist Party. Why do China's prospects actually look weaker longer term than we would conventionally think?
Why do you care? Why? What's with all the focus about what they're doing in their country? Who cares? I have an idea. What about we focus on what the United States government is doing economically to people in this country? We're so invested in what China's doing over there with their economy. What about the U.S. economy? What about the fact that the homeless population has been increasing over the past 2 years? What's that? I just showed you the video earlier about the rent spikes. Where's the desire to, where's that? So I think we need to focus on the economic issues that we have in our own country before we go and criticize economic issues in China. Because I had students who are from China. And you know what? Whenever they reach out to me, because most of them went back home after they graduated, most of them didn't want to live here, just wanted to come here for school. When we touch base, when we reconnect, you know what? They're living their best life. That's what they're doing.
I think the first point to note is that, double-digit growth rates and a steady rise is not the norm for any country, and especially not for China. Really, the past 40 years have been an anomaly. Most of Chinese modern history is a tale of strife and poverty. I mean, really, for 100 years, from 1839, from the First Opium War to the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, China's...
He's talking about the history of China is a lot of strife and poverty. And the history of the United States? Like, what? The history of the United States? Strife and poverty? Slavery? Jim Crow? Ghettos? Immigrants living in ghettos? Black people living in ghettos? You want to talk about strife and poverty? Let's not pretend like these issues did not exist.
Just ripped apart by imperialist powers and has two of the worst civil wars in recorded history. The Taiping Rebellion alone kills 20 to 30 million people in the middle of the 19th century. And then even after the Chinese Communist Party unifies the nation.
And how many police have killed Black people in the United States? How many of that?
Kicks out the Japanese. China becomes the #1 enemy of the United States almost immediately because of the Korean War, where they're fighting each other. And then 10 years later, China becomes the #1 enemy of the Soviet Union because you have the Sino-Soviet split. And so it's not till the 1970s that China is not isolated and impoverished. And there are certain exceptional circumstances that made for China's subsequent exceptional rise. And we think that all four of those circumstances are going away quickly. I mean, one is just you have U.S. engagement and this period of hyper-globalization where the U.S. sort of fast tracks China's entry in.
That's code word for imperialism, by the way. That globalization, that's code word for imperialism.
To Western markets so it can get access to those markets, access to Western technology and capital. And this is the start of what we now refer to as hyper-globalization. And lots of countries said, hey, we want to actually get in on China's economy. It's perfectly situated, huge population for labor and consumption. And so China's able to ride that wave of hyper-globalization to become the workshop of the world. A second sort of fleeting factor is the demographic dividend. So China in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s had anywhere between 10 to 15 workers for every retiree in its population. And that's because China had a big baby boom in the 1950s and 60s, then followed that up with a one-child policy. And so no population was more primed for productivity, I think, in human history than China was over the last 40 years. You had resource abundance. China was almost self-sufficient in most resources, which made growth very cheap because you had easy access to inputs. And then you had a Chinese government that was prioritizing economic growth and was willing to kind of get out of the way and let the Chinese people do their thing and have sort of quasi-private enterprises to engage with foreigners and set up export platforms. But lately, we've seen all four of these factors really reverse. Obviously, we're moving from a period of hyper-globalization to what some people are calling a new Cold War. I mean, the United States is waging a trade and tech war on China. Various other economies are following.
Notice he said the United States is waging that war. You heard that right? The U.S. is waging the tech war on China, not the other way around.
China now faces thousands of new trade and investment barriers today that it didn't face as recently as 10 years ago. China's running out of resources. Half of its water and arable land, almost all of its deposits of energy are gone. And now it's the #1 importer of food and energy and is suffering water scarcity. That's made growth 3 times more expensive. Every unit of GDP growth is 3 times more expensive to produce today. than it was in the 2000s, just because inputs are so much more expensive and scarce. You have the end of that demographic dividend. Just between now and the early 2030s, China's going to lose 70 million working age adults and gain 120 million senior citizens. So that's like taking an entire France out of your workforce and adding an entire Japan of elderly retirees into your population. And then lastly, the Chinese government seems to be sliding back towards neo-totalitarianism. And that wouldn't be so bad if Xi Jinping was a savvy economic reformer, but he just shows time and again, he is willing to sacrifice economic growth and efficiency in order to enhance his political control. The zero COVID lockdowns are just the latest manifestation of that. But, you can look at the
Wait a minute. I'm sorry, but don't our politicians do the same thing? This part right here.
You have the end of that demographic dividend. Just between now and the early 2030s, China's going to lose 70 million working age adults and gain 120 million senior citizens. So that's like taking an entire France out of your workforce and adding an entire Japan of elderly retirees into your population. And then lastly, the Chinese government seems to be sliding back towards neo-totalitarianism. And that wouldn't be so bad if Xi Jinping was a savvy economic reformer, but he just shows time and again, he is willing to sacrifice economic growth and efficiency in order to enhance his political control. The zero COVID lockdowns are just the latest manifestation of that. But, you can look at the regulatory crackdown on tech companies, the fact that subsidies are channeled to state-owned enterprises that are very...
Our government has crackdowns on tech companies too. It may not be exactly the same as China, but let's not pretend here the United States government... This is puzzling. Do people believe this shit? Like, this is really puzzling to me because I'm just like, look, I showed you the interview. What was that, last week with Joe Rogan and Mark Zuckerberg? Zuckerberg admitted that the FBI came to him and told him what not to put on Facebook. So why are we pretending like we don't have the same, or maybe not the same, but we don't have censorship? Our government isn't censoring us too. Why are we pretending this?
Inefficient, the outline of negative economic news, which obviously makes reform hard. So we just look at all of these headwinds. We show that they're actually going to get worse in the years ahead. And that's why we characterize China more as a peaking power rather than one that's going to continue to rise. It's really returning to the historical norm of encountering geopolitical hostility in a much more difficult growth environment.
Bro, and this isn't the first video where they've done like this China. Look at the title, you guys. Why a peaking China is dangerous. Notice that's in all caps for the world. Dangerous. It's like, let me see. They have the comments on here. Let me see if they have them. Because when I saw the comments were not too good. Let's see. This one, casually discussing the extraction of wealth and resources from other nations for the sake of the US like it was a good thing. That comment has 94 likes. You guys see what I'm saying? You see the problem? So I had a poll question for you because I've been noticing something about breaking points. It seems like they seem to be for imperialism. They don't, I don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, but are there any anti-war voices on breaking points? Like, I mean, a part of the actual lineup, not a guest. I mean, actually a part. Is there anyone on breaking points that is anti-war and pushing that rhetoric? Is there anyone on there pushing mutual aid rhetoric and pushing direct action rhetoric? Is there anyone on there who's anti-imperialist and is actually pushing that rhetoric? If not, why is that? Because to me, what I've seen from them, it's just almost like they're doing MSNBC News and CNN News and Fox News. They're doing their job for them, but on YouTube through an independent outlet. If they're still preaching these imperialist concepts and these imperialist ideas and advocating for this fear that people should have over China. Guys, I didn't live through this stuff before. They did the same thing. I went through the deal with the Iraq war. There's so much fear, right? If they're doing that, then basically, then that would mean that they're being puppets for mainstream media only through an independent outlet. And all of the people that are left or progressive per se, who followed Crystal and Sagar because they came from Rising, which is where I actually first saw them on independent. Well, Rising's not independent, but on YouTube. It's like night and day. It's weird. They're independent now, but I feel like I hear more mainstream media talking points from them now than I did when they were on Rising. And Rising is not independent. Rising is corporate. I don't know. Go look at the comments of this video. Go look in the comments, because I had to stop scrolling. I don't know. The poll question was, does Breaking Point support imperialism? And this is guys, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to attack. This is a genuine question. Now, this is 450 votes. 72% of you said yes. 8% said no. 21% said not sure. So honestly, I really don't, the messages that has been coming from them is concerning. Someone mentioned something just a second ago. Seriously, maybe I missed the comment. Is anybody on there anti-war and is actually expressing that they're anti-war? And I don't mean that you're anti-war except for this. I mean, anti-war, anti-imperialist. Is anyone on there that is that? Because I don't hear the pushback. Where was the pushback? There's no what? That's the results of the poll. But look, it's concerning. It's concerned. Yeah, Kitty Films, where's the push? Where's the pushback? This ain't the first time there's been someone that came on there to talk about China. There was another person that came on to talk about China, and the comments in that section were bad too. Because people are like, why the fuck you not push back on this dude with these talking points? Bizarro Joe Marshall is a host from The Realignment, and it's pretty damn conservative. It's funny. It's just like, so it's okay for there to be conservatives on Breaking Points, but it's not okay for there to be conservatives on the Jimmy Dore Show. Make that make sense. You guys see the problem? No. But yeah, I can't, man. I can't make up. I don't know where this is coming from, but we already have mainstream media. We don't need more mainstream media.